Okay, we're live.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I'm gonna throw up. Okay, no, I'm okay. Let's get into it. Hello, everybody. Today we're gonna be talking about feral children. Now, before I get into this, I just want to say that some of these instances are really disturbing and just downright sad. But I wanted to be noted that I'm not making fun of these kids. A lot of them were dealt a pretty unfair hand, and they deserve respect just like every other person on Earth because they are human. They are human. Now, after doing a lot of research into the stories of different feral children, I feel like a lot of them aren't necessarily fake, but they're greatly exaggerated in a lot of the ones that became more popular nowadays. So I weeded a lot of these out, and I have a few more authentic stories of feral children, about 3 really good ones. But thank you guys for watching my content. My channel's been growing quite a bit recently, so go ahead and subscribe if you're weird and you like this weird stuff that you're about to watch right now. Anyways, let's get into it. So, a feral child is a human child who has lived away from human contact from a very young age, and has had little or no experience of human care, loving, or social behavior, and crucially, human language. Feral children are confined by humans, often parents, or what we're going to be talking about mainly today, raised by animals or isolated in the wild. Now, probably the best known feral child throughout all of history is probably Dina Sanichar. Now, just a disclaimer on this story, this was told back in the day. Some of it may be a little bit exaggerated, but as far as like feral children stories go, this is really one of the most authentic and real ones that I could find. Now, Dina Sanichar was first spotted deep in the northern Indian jungle of Uttar Pradesh in either the late 1860s or the early 1870s, because nobody knows the time exactly, by a group of hunters who saw him walking around on all fours. And they saw him following a wolf, and then found him actually going into the wolf's den while the wolves were in the cave. So at this time, he was actually in the wolf's den with the wolves, which at this point, I'm not sure if the hunters knew that he was actually being raised by them, or if they just thought he was crazy following these wolves. But eventually, after watching him for a while, this is when they realized that he was actually living among the wolves in the cave. So they took it upon themselves to try and capture him. They attempted to lure him out by calling him, which he obviously didn't understand, and he didn't answer them too, so it became more evident that he was just a feral child. Which you might be thinking that this was quite an anomaly at the time, but back then, especially in India for some reason, there was just numerous accounts of feral children, some more authentic than others. Which, why India? Well, back at this time, India had a whole bunch of really rural tribes and villages where people were really secluded from the rest of civilization. Just like I talked about in my Man-Eater series, there was a lot of instances of attacks from wolves, tigers, leopards. Pretty much any wild animal was like a huge threat in India, and their life expectancy was really low. At this time, they claimed that there was instances of children being raised by panthers and dogs, which didn't seem too crazy, but some people claimed that they saw children being raised by chickens, which I don't think so. A common trait of feral children was their inability to walk on 2 legs. They almost always walked on all fours, and struggled to walk correctly even after they entered human society. But anyways, the hunters decided to smoke out Dina because he wouldn't budge at all to their coaxing. The hunters planted a fire at the opening of the cave where the pack of wolves slowly came out, and the hunters shot and killed each wolf as they appeared. And they then captured the boy as he came out as well. So basically, this kid watched his entire family get murdered by these guys and then get carried off by his family's murderers, where he was then expected to integrate into their society. So you might be asking yourself, how did this boy come into the care of wolves? Well, at this time, like I said, there was other instances of feral children, but there was actually 6 other alleged accounts of wolves actually carrying children off from villages, where they were then found later being cared for by the wolves for some reason. Which, like, why would wolves do this? Well, sometimes in nature, like animals like dogs or cows or whatever, they will lose their pups or their calves, and then they will like adopt another animal and then nurse them as if they're their own. Like, dogs can do that with cats, cows can do that with horses, colts, I mean. So this may be what happened to the wolves. They carried off a kid, and then after their litter of pups died, maybe they then adopted him as their own pup. So I guess it's possible. So the hunters who had just captured this boy assessed that he was roughly 6 years old, because they obviously didn't know for sure, and the kid didn't know how old he was, and he couldn't speak English. And they took the boy back into their village to show him off to the locals, where The village then, who saw him, were really fascinated and terrified by a boy that was raised by wolves. He was then brought to a mission-run orphanage where he was then baptized and then given his name, which is Sanichar, which meant Saturday because he arrived at the facility on Saturday. Which I think this was a really huge missed opportunity because it's like this boy was raised by wolves. They could have named him something like Wolfsbane or Fang or something really cool because, he's like a survivor. He made it through his childhood with wolves. Anyways, the orphanage was ran by a man named Father Earhart, a missionary living in India, who noted that Dina Sanichar was undoubtedly idiotic. His words, not mine. But that the kids still showed signs of sound judgment and reason from time to time. Although it did seem like having a home would be the best thing for a young boy without a family that was found living in the jungle, the staff there, who tried to do their best to care for Dina, just didn't know how to communicate with him properly. He would often howl or bark like a wolf, leading the staff to believe that he was trying to communicate with them. After some time at the orphanage, Dina was noted to be a complete outsider. He really struggled in his new life in the civilized world. It was said that he only ate meat and greatly preferred it raw, especially when he first showed up. He absolutely would not eat cooked food. But slowly he began to realize how good cooked meat was, but he still only ate meat. And that whenever he finished his meals, he'd really show this wolf-like behavior by sharpening his teeth on the bones from his meal, which is what wolves and dogs do. He despised wearing clothes and appeared to have no capacity for language, even though he wasn't mute. He'd make animal noises instead, growling or grunting whenever he wanted something. Now, not having the capacity to communicate with other humans is something called feral child syndrome. This is a condition that happens whenever kids don't communicate with humans during this early development part of their lives. And this is actually something that's happened in more modern times in this really sad story. In 1970, there was this 13-year-old girl named Jeannie Wiley who was found to have been raised in social isolation with little to no human contact. She was raised by an abusive father who tied her to a potty chair in a small room for the majority of her life, and when she attempted to make noise or talk with him, he abused her. She was completely unable to make verbal words all her life. Even after substantial study and rehab, she never became able to speak. Because psychologists believe that if you don't learn or have human communication during this development period of your life, you can never learn to talk at any point in your life, which is really strange. Dina Sanichar, being a feral child, made him have some other interesting characteristics. It was said that he was insensitive to heat even when it was really hot outside, in the same way with cold. Just like dogs or wolves do, they don't really care what temperature it is out, unless you got one of those little indoor dogs. As Dina grew older, he began to show more human-like behaviors. He learned how to use the restroom, ate normally, dressed, walked upright, and even started wearing shoes. However, he continued to howl and bark and make people think he was trying to communicate with them through animal noises. He also had little or no attachment to human beings, but he did form a bond with one other human who had a similar condition with him. So one day, this other feral child was brought to the orphanage who had allegedly been found with wolves, which I couldn't find much information on this kid. It was said that he was the wolf boy of something, and after I looked that stuff up, it was just I could not find any reliable sources on any of that. But anyways, this was another young boy who Dina had a lot in common with. Apparently they quickly became friends. They often played together, and Dina actually ended up teaching the boy how to hold a cup and how to drink out of it. It became clear to his caretakers that Dina was more comfortable around other feral children than he was around normal humans. And that never seemed to change throughout his entire life. Despite spending a lot of time, about 20 years at the orphanage, Dina made little progress in assimilating into civilized society. For example, he ate off of a plate, but he would still smell his food every time before he ate it, and he seemed to not want anything but meat, and did prefer it raw. Still. He was hunched over at 5 feet tall, so he was pretty short, and he always appeared to never be at ease, always anxious and jumpy, as if he was in fight or flight mode at all times. If you look at this picture of him, and you look into his eyes, you can tell that this kid just always was still in fight or flight mode, even after being at the orphanage for a long time. Unfortunately, wearing clothes and walking on 2 legs weren't the only human characteristic that Dina adopted at the orphanage. Somehow he managed to pick up the habit of smoking cigarettes from the caretakers, which it's not clear why he started smoking, but some people speculate that in this case he thought that he would look more human if he smoked or while he smoked, or he felt more human or more included or whatever. Anyways, all his smoking took a toll on Dina's health. He became a chain smoker and eventually died of tuberculosis in 1895. Dina Sanichar lived a short life, dying at the age of 34. However, I looked it up and the life expectancy in India in 1890 was like 25 anyway, so by those standards he lived a pretty alright life, so decent. Decent for a kid raised by wolves. You can take the boy out of the jungle, but you can't take the jungle out of the boy. Dina Sanichar's story tells us that civilization is learned and not something instinctive. I feel like Dina's story is a great example of what lack of love can do to a human. Like, if you don't know, there's this thing where infants between the ages of 6 and 14 months of age, if they're abandoned, they get this severe psychological trauma for the rest of their life. Many cases of children with little attention at these detrimental moments in their infancy becomes a cornerstone for their entire personality. Like, for example, Ted Kaczynski, who is most famously known as the Unabomber, when he was at this vital point in his development age as an infant, he was left at a hospital and barely got his mother's care for roughly a week or maybe a little bit more than a week. And they say that this was detrimental to his lifelong mental health. Well, that and then also what the CIA did. But just looking into Dina's eyes in this picture and just seeing his entire life in fight or flight mode makes you realize that his childhood had such a great impact on him. Just like a loving family or just a mother would do so much for a child like this. I also want to say that Dina Sanichar was the person who directly inspired the character from The Jungle Book, which was actually written in 1894, just 1 year before Dina's death, which that story was a lot more lighthearted and didn't have as much problems with society and death and being isolated. So that's the first story, Dina Sanichar, pretty crazy. This next story is really crazy. They find these two children living among wolves. One's only like 1.5 years old, the other one's 8, and for some reason they thought that they're wolves when they looked at them. The kids, that is. Anyways, just a disclaimer on this story on Kamala and Amala. This story came from this guy who was their caretaker. A lot of people think that it was completely made up or extremely exaggerated, but I thought it was a pretty cool story, so I wanted to include it because it's really famous. Anyways, so the story of Kamala and Amala. They were raised by she-wolves in 1920. As the story goes, Reverend J.A.L. Singh saw a mother wolf and cubs, two whom had long, matted hair and looked almost human. After considerable preparations and difficulties, the two human-like creatures were captured by the Reverend, and they turned out to be two girls whose ages were assessed by Singh to be about 8 years old and the other one 1.5. So this guy said that he captured these girls and that they didn't look human. They were physically deformed and they had the characteristics of wolves. The way they acted was like wolves. He said that their tendons and joints in their arms were shortened. They had misshapen jaws, elongated canines. They walked on all fours and even had eyes that shone in the dark like dog's eyes. I don't think so. That sounds like a great exaggeration. And living with humans was really hard for these girls. They often slept curled up together. They growled. They ate nothing but raw meat and howled at night. Like other feral children, they developed acute senses of hearing, sight, and smell. Unfortunately, though, Amala died a year after she was discovered, the younger one, but Kamala survived until she was 17 years of age, by which point she had learned how to walk upright, spoke about 50 words, and even was eating a human diet. So how did the girls get in this situation? The girls were taken to this orphanage in Mindapur, India, where the Reverend and his wife were stationed. Singh described them as wolfish in appearance and behavior. They walked, like I just said, they walked on all fours. They had calluses on their knees and their palms from doing that all the time. And they were really fond of raw meat, and they would steal it any chance they got. He said they would lick all their liquids with their tongues. They ate food in a crouched position, and that their tongues always hung out of their mouths like dogs or wolves. He also said that they never slept after midnight, and that they prowled at night and howled at the moon. I don't know if they howled at the moon, they just howled, he said. Anyways, they moved really fast, just like squirrels, and it was difficult to capture them if they didn't want you around. They would also, if they were approached, they would make faces like dogs or wolves, sometimes baring their teeth. Singh also noted that their hearing was very acute and that they could smell meat from a great distance. Furthermore, they could not see well during the day, and they could orient themselves very well at night. In September 1921, both girls became ill, and Amala, the younger one, died, like I just said. She lived only 1 year in society. The other girl, though, learned how to do stuff in human society from Mrs. Singh. She softened her skin with oil, massaged her and feeding her, caressed her. She grew her confidence through all that, and then was willing to learn from her. And after 5 years at the orphanage, Kamala demonstrated some intellectual functions. She knew some of the names of the babies housed there, she understood the concept of color, and she accepted food from her plate, and knew her glass from among the others. As far as language development is concerned, a visitor, Bishop H. Pakenham Walsh, provided an outsider's description of her progress. He said when he saw Kamala, she could speak quite clearly and distinctly about 30 words. When she was told to say what a certain object was, she would name it, but she never really learned how to use words in a spontaneous way. But he saw her 2 years later, and she had learned a good many more words, according to him. Now at this point, Kamala and Singh's fame had grown and spread throughout the world, and an invitation arrived from the Psychological Society of New York in 1928, offering to take Kamala to the United States where she could be presented to the public. However, the invitation could not be considered as Kamala grew weak, her health less secure throughout the years, and somewhat unexpectedly she died November 1929. Pretty sad, pretty weird, and probably pretty inaccurate. So that's the story of Kamala and Amala. I think a lot of it was pretty much word of mouth and greatly exaggerated. A lot of people don't even think that they were feral at all, but this dude just really elaborated on it. But this next one is probably the most authentic one, considering it's so recent, and a lot of psychologists went in and studied this kid, and they think that he was legit raised by monkeys. So John Ssebunya, this is his story. From 1991, a boy was found living in the jungle with monkeys. The article that I got most of the information from about him was written in 1999, and it was like a interview with his family. He was 2 or 3, no one can be sure, though Paul and Molly have since given him a nominal birthday to celebrate. Basically, this kid's father murdered his mother, and then this kid, John, fled into the jungle, apparently terrified that his father was going to kill him next, which his father was later found and hung. And then, once this kid was in the jungle, a civil war broke out and nobody went to the area for a long time, and that's why he wasn't found for so long. For the next 8 months to a year, John lived in the wild at 4 years old. That's the age they probably think he was. They're not for sure how old he was. He vaguely remembers the first monkeys coming up to him after a few days and offering him roots and nuts and sweet potatoes. He says they were very weary at first, but after he posed no threat, they befriended him, and after about 2 weeks, they taught him to travel with them, to search for food, and to climb trees. He recalls that he didn't sleep very well. He remembers that he would just climb up a tree, try to sleep there, couldn't sleep, climb back down the tree, couldn't sleep on the bottom, but eventually I guess he learned how to. So this place was in the middle of the Civil War, like I said, until one day, many months later, this woman named Millie went further into the jungle than she had meant to in search for firewood when she came across a small pack of monkeys and realized there was something really odd about one of them. At first, Paul explains, she thought there was something wrong with one of the monkeys because it had no tail. It was only when she looked closer that she got the fright of her life. John was brought back to Millie's village, and for the next few weeks was the center of attention, some good, some bad. Apparently the children in the village were pretty cruel to him for a while. And when John was asked about this today, about how the children reacted towards him, it was pretty understanding. He says that they were just really interested in him, and that because he was so different, that's just kind of how he expected people to react. So that's nice that he, doesn't hold grudges. But today John only speaks in monosyllables, and he refuses to meet anyone's eyes, which is kind of a common trait in monkey society. They don't make eye contact because it's like a dominance thing. Millie and others tried to nurse him and fed him hot food, which sent him into 3 days of horrible sickness. They essentially saved his life, and all experts agreed that he could not have survived much longer in the wild at that age in that place. It was just way too dangerous of a place. They then got in touch with Paul and Molly, who collected him and took them into their home, which was beside an orphanage which they ran that had 1,500 visiting children. Paul, who was John's adopted father, recalled him being extremely wild when he got there. He had a lot of hair, which was apparently really common in feral children. They just get a bunch of body hair. His knees had grown almost white from walking on them, and his nails had grown hugely and curled around. And he was, of course, not house-trained or anything like that. John's new father talks about how they can never know how much time he really spent with the monkeys, but it really changed him. Even now, you can see that he's traumatized still, but he still turned out really well for being raised in the wild with monkeys as a 4-year-old. His new father talks about how he seems very happy nowadays, but when he walks, it's kind of a strange, lopsided gait, and that when he runs, it's equally odd. Although he's reputedly a very good footballer or soccer player if you're American. When he lifts a bottle to drink, it's always kind of weird. He holds it with his wrist and his first finger, which he's not, although a lot of experts suggest mentally disabled. He catches nuances, listens carefully, and at the time this article was written, he was traveling as part of the African Children's Choir, which is really cool that he was actually that great in society that he can go and sing in a choir. But his father says that he is undoubtedly still traumatized. So they also asked him if he was grateful or scared of the monkeys at this point. And John's father was talking about how he didn't really understand emotional questions like this. It's difficult to evaluate emotions. But then John goes on to say, I am grateful. Yes, I am. Not because of love from them, from the monkeys, but because of what they did made it possible for me to be loved by other people, by humans. I feel like this is just such a nice thing for him to say. He's really fitting in society and so grateful to be here, which I feel like most people take for granted, just having the love of other humans around them. When this article was written, he said that when he grows up, he wants to work with animals. Chickens or pigs maybe, but not monkeys. He says that he doesn't want to work with monkeys. Alright, so I also watched a documentary about John, a more recent one in 2007, because this last one I was just talking about was 1999, now we're in 2007. Basically, this psychologist went in and was evaluating John and where he was and what kind of monkeys he was with. And basically the conclusion was the monkeys did not care for him, but more tolerated his presence. They, if you're in a monkey society, they will groom you and look for bugs on you, and then you'll groom them back, which they did not do for him. They just kind of tolerated him being around. They didn't actually care for him or bring him food. They more or less would eat food, and then they would have a bunch of scraps because these type of monkeys would just get such an ungodly amount of food, and that he would end up eating those scraps, and that's how he survived as a 4-year-old in the jungle with a bunch of monkeys, because they didn't groom him, and they actually bit off his toe at one point. He was missing a toe, which is really sad because that's a 4-year-old. Anyways, in this 2007 documentary, he could communicate really well with people. Well, he could kind of communicate pretty well. He had a brother with him his brother would kind of translate a lot of stuff for him to other people. But I just think that John, in this documentary, you can tell that he's just the sweetest kid, and that he was dealt such a bad hand. But even though all the neglect and the abandonment, even when he got back into society, the cruelness from the children, it just makes you realize how much good there is in the world, because John was fully embraced by a loving family, and he embraced them back and embraced humanity, even when everything humanity gave to him was evil. And it makes you realize, how much good there is in the world. So don't forget that we're living in a good world, and that despite the large amount of evil, there is, in my opinion, a much larger amount of good. Okay, so when I was doing research for this video, it was originally going to be about the feral people conspiracy in national parks, but after I got into it more, there was no solid evidence on anything, or it was just all speculation and nonsense. So I was just well, these stories on the feral children are pretty interesting, so I'll just do that instead. But as far as I will really quick go into detail about the national park feral people conspiracy. I'm sure you've heard of the missing 411. If you don't know what that is, it's just documented cases of people who have gone missing in national parks or elsewhere in that area, and basically they're all really mysterious and they don't make sense, and it seems that there's some grand conspiracy to why people go missing in these national park areas or caved areas. A disproportionate amount of people go missing in national parks or areas with cave systems. Here, we'll look at this map. On the top of this map, this is the missing 411 people. On the bottom of this map, this is America's cave systems. And these caves seem to play a really interesting role in some of these disappearances, especially Mammoth Caves. If you look there, it is such a massive amount of people that go missing in these areas, which you might think maybe these people are just disappearing in the caves. Maybe they're not telling people before they go in and they go missing. But that's a lot of people. And then if you look at another map right here, this is the national park map, it lines up with all the disappearances as well. So this is where we're going to get really crazy. So the idea of the missing 411, like feral people national park conspiracy, there's a few different crazy ideas, which none of them I'm saying are real, but the idea is that these are places set aside on purpose to control the amount of people going in, and that there are these larger tribes of like feral people living in these national parks and or cave systems that will attack you if you go there. So now there's no evidence that any of these people exist other than just complete speculation. However, there are many strange cases that don't quite make sense. In addition to that, there's like a lot of folklore from back in the day about things like wild people, like the Sasquatch ape-men things that were part of Native American folklore, which I feel like people don't really know about that. Like Bigfoot came from Native American folklore about this tribe in like the northwestern area in the United States, where there's this land surveyor who had, it was really early, it was like the first European explorers were surveying the land. They were talking with these tribes and they're like, yeah, there's these big hairy people in the mountains that'll come into our tribes and take our women. And he's like, oh my gosh. And so that's the situation of where those sort of things came from. I feel like that was one of the first Bigfoot incidences, along with like the, what was it, Ape Canyon thing? Yeah, there was like the Ape Canyon thing. Anyways, there's also like another idea that this land was set aside for more supernatural reasons, like skinwalkers, which are like in Navajo culture, they're these witch-like people that basically shapeshift into animals or people or whatever they want to look like. Or things like the Wendigo, which we all know what that is. They're like spirits that possess people whenever they consume human flesh or get greedy or that sort of thing. Or just other creatures that are more supernatural that specifically live in regions like this, where they basically require the flesh of humans to survive, which is really dark if the national parks were that. And the idea is that these park systems basically sacrifice people to the cave people, to the supernatural skinwalker thingies, and that basically these national parks specifically sacrifice people to these cave people, to these supernatural entities, which, for the record, I don't believe is true. This is complete speculation, but it's just interesting to talk about. I just wanted to share that because I wanted to do this video on that, but I didn't want to go into complete nonsense. But whether you believe in the Wendigo, Bigfoot, and caveman or not, this video is not about that. This video is mainly about the feral children, and I just want to say that it's truly inspiring the way these children persevered through possibly the toughest situation that a child could possibly find themselves in. It's just truly inspiring. Stories like this remind me that the human spirit is truly indomitable, and it really is amazing what people are capable of when they want to survive. But yeah, that's all I got for this video. I'm in Yellowstone National Park right now, so wish me luck. I got interested in the feral people national park conspiracy and went down the rabbit hole, and I was like, oh, I gotta do this video. But then I was like, I can't do that. But I mean, thanks for watching. You guys are great. If you have any video ideas, drop them in the comments. I like doing the research for this. Those kids, man, they're crazy. Crazy that they can survive for so much and so long in isolation, and humans are pretty powerful. Anyways, watch out for the cave people. Don't forget to feed your spirit things in the national parks. Thank you and goodbye. Have a good one. Bye. What the heck? Hey, get back. No. Oh my gosh. Cut it out. Go, go.